I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. Hi everyone, welcome to Margs and Mayhem. I really appreciate your patience over the last few days. When I started Margs and Mayhem, one thing that I told myself was that I was going to do my very best to post every single Thursday. Very regular posting. I knew there were some times where I was going to have planned absences. For example, my job gets super busy over the summer, and so I knew there would be some weeks where I wouldn't be able to upload then. But I guess no one could predict that there was going to be a snowpocalypse here in Texas. I did post about it on Instagram, but the mayhem was real here at my house. It got down to 40s and below inside my house. We lost power for 47 hours. I mean, the chickens were even in the garage. It's been kind of a wild week. But things are doing great now. The weather has warmed up so nicely. The snow is melting. The power is back. We have water. And I'm certainly glad to be getting back to Margs and Mayhem. I hope this is worth the wait. Okay, I'm not going to lie to y'all. I basically took this recipe entirely from a website called Gimme Some Oven. The recipe that I put in the description box is altered some. It's cut in half in case you don't want to make a serving size of 6. And I did alter for sweetness just a bit because I thought it was a little bit too sweet. But look at it. It's beautiful. The bottom layer is a layer of a blueberry margarita. The middle layer is a coconut margarita, although the website does say you could do a plain lime margarita if you wanted. But let me tell you, this coconut margarita is chef's kiss. And a strawberry margarita at the top, and then it does in fact have a sugar rim, which is kind of rare for me, but it's really delicious. It is a frozen margarita, so I went ahead and made it in advance, and I do get the irony about doing a frozen margarita after this week of snow in Texas, but it was already planned, and let me tell you, it is delicious. I'll for sure link the original recipe in the description box, so you can go check that out if you want. Before we even start, I'd like to just talk a little bit about word choice and the terminology that I'm going to use today. I have deliberately chosen to use the terms laid out for us by political scientists across the country, including political scientists from Harvard. The reason for this, they are the experts, and I want to trust the experts when I use the terminology. I also want to make something abundantly clear. I am only choosing to talk about things that are verified facts, and when I say verified, I mean it can be triangulated with 3 different sources. Yes, 3 sources. It has taken a long time to write this episode. I'm not going to talk about conspiracy theories, and I'm not going to talk about things that people can't provide proof for, despite the fact that I'm sure almost everyone that was at the riots had a camera in the form of a cell phone just in their pockets. If you're here for the conspiracies, it's probably best to move along, and I hope you'll come back for the murder and the mayhem another time. The Margs will always be waiting for you. The events of January 6th, 2021 start well before January 6th, 2021. For weeks and months, Trump had been urging his supporters to actually come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th to protest the outcome of the election and to attempt to sway Republican lawmakers into protesting those results and stopping the election from being certified. In fact, several simultaneous rallies had been scheduled on that day in Washington, D.C. There was also planning by several far-right groups prior to January 6th. This included the Proud Boys, who are self-described as a Western male chauvinist club. They were instructed by their president, Enrique Tarrio, in a Parler post the week prior to come and wear all black. Enrique himself did not come to the riots. Men arriving in body armor showed up to the Capitol on January 6th and were identified as members of the Oath Keepers, a far-right militia group who has wanted to start a civil war on behalf of Donald Trump. And I'm not getting into QAnon because those people freak me out. But they're not really a group per se, more so an ideology. There were lots of members of QAnon at the riots. Before noon on January 6th, groups start gathering both at the White House, where Trump is scheduled to speak at noon, and on the Capitol grounds. At 12:15, Trump tells his supporters that after he's finished, they need to march down Pennsylvania Avenue together to go and try and give the Republican lawmakers some courage to do what they need to do. Let's just gloss over the fact that he also said he was going to be walking with them, but anyway. Before Trump is even finished with his speech, people leave and start walking to the Capitol. And as this is happening, both the people on the Capitol grounds and the people walking there start to get more and more agitated. Just before 1, a pipe bomb will be found at the RNC building, or the Republican National Convention. And shortly after, a pipe bomb will be found at the Democratic National Convention building. Both of these buildings are within 3 blocks of the U.S. Capitol. At right around 1 o'clock, when Trump is still speaking, actually, a group of protesters begin to violently harass the Capitol police officers guarding the Capitol grounds and eventually overwhelm them and push through the barriers. At this point, at least on this side of the Capitol, they've made it through the outer fencing. Meanwhile, at 1 o'clock, the joint session of Congress convened to begin certifying the election results. A quick note on this process that I think nobody actually cared about before last month. Congress has long interpreted constitutional language to say that they can object to election results should they believe that there's an issue with them. However, the bar to do this is very high, and it's almost impossible that an objection will go through. It was really a lost cause for these Republican congresspeople to object to these election results, and it sort of looked like it was really just political posturing at that point and a way to win favor with their far-right constituents. More on that later. Trump's speech ended around 1:15, and he again urged his supporters to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. So they did. Trump himself disappears into the White House for several hours. By 2 o'clock, hundreds of Trump protesters have breached the outer fencing on the northwest side of the Capitol grounds. They begin to make their way towards the building. The Capitol Police have clearly been overwhelmed, and at this time, their chief basically begs for support from the DC National Guard. It's around this time that the eastern side of the Capitol grounds are also breached by rioters. At around 2:10, protesters break through a door and a window on the west side of the Capitol and break into the building. Finally, at this point, the Senate is called into recess. At 2:14, Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman lures a large group of rioters away from the Senate doors and up a flight of stairs. Inside the Senate chamber, officers are desperately working to lock the doors. Using only his wits and his body, Eugene does 3 things simultaneously. He leads rioters away from the Senate chambers, he coordinates for backup on the second floor landing, and he exercises extreme restraint to prevent injury and loss of life. Representative Emanuel Cleaver from Missouri writes, quote, "If not for the quick, decisive, and heroic actions from Officer Goodman, the tragedy of last week's insurrection could have multiplied in magnitude to levels never before seen in American history." End quote. On February 12, 2021, Congress voted unanimously to award Officer Goodman the Congressional Gold Medal. For his part, Officer Goodman would have preferred a little more anonymity, though he said he would do it again. A true hero of the day. More than 5 minutes after the mob enters the building, the House of Representatives is also called into recess. Now, police are clashing with the rioters inside the building as some members of Congress are able to escape. Others are trapped inside as rioters pound on the doors. Congresspeople left in the chamber begin to lie down and hide amongst the chairs in the gallery. Meanwhile, outside the building, the mob becomes larger as people finish coming over from Trump's rally, and they become increasingly violent, dragging and beating officers. It was said that many of the young Capitol staffers knew exactly what to do once the mob breached the Capitol. It wasn't instinct, it was training from their 12 years of public school. I was a public school teacher for nearly a decade, and this really hit close to home. One of Nancy Pelosi's staffers, a 23-year-old, thought back to her time doing active shooter drills. She said, quote, "In the Fairfax County public school system, we had a lockdown drill every year where we were taught to turn out the lights, block all the windows, not open the door for any reason, and to stay away from the windows. Once we were settled in the dark, what was running through my mind was to be ready to run and fight. Thank goodness that didn't have to happen." End quote. People were hiding all over the Capitol, including Vice President Mike Pence. It would be revealed later that not only did Trump not call to check on his vice president during this time, he didn't even check on him for 5 days afterwards. Meanwhile, congresspeople are calling Trump left and right, some of them engaging in screaming matches with him, telling him that he had to do something to stop these people that he had literally sent down just a few hours earlier from his rally. I mean, he had actually said, "We're gonna walk down to the Capitol." So it seems that almost everyone that had even a semblance of a relationship with Trump was trying to get a hold of him during this time, to get him to do something, even including Governor Chris Christie, who was nowhere near the Capitol. We've seen a lot of the pictures that have sort of been turned into memes from this event on social media or on the news. Who can forget that guy carrying Nancy Pelosi's podium with his big grin on his face, or people sitting in the Senate chairs taking selfies, and of course the guy that crashed into Nancy Pelosi's office and stole her mail, that QAnon shaman guy and his horns. How can we forget that girl that got maced, or was it an onion, and seemed surprised that would happen if you tried to break and enter into a federal building. But what we haven't seen as often is the massive amounts of people carrying guns, both concealed and open. We don't see as often the people who had giant zip ties, the kind that you use to arrest people with or to take hostages. They were shouting to hang Mike Pence. They were literally on the hunt for Nancy Pelosi and AOC and others. They wanted to string people up. They erected an entire gallows on the Capitol grounds, for God's sakes. This was a violent insurrection. And if not for the heroic actions of people like Eugene Goodman, congresspeople who had military experience, and those young staffers who knew what to do because of active shooter drills, who knows what might have happened? And where was Trump? Throughout the day, he released some half-hearted tweets, including one to back the blue. Meanwhile, his supporters were literally smashing a police officer in between a door and a door frame while trying to heave-ho their way inside the building. Eventually, he's convinced to make a video, and he calls the rioters very special. And to him, I think they were. This is released at 4:17, hours after the rioters have been terrorizing the Capitol and generally just causing chaos. At this point, things were out of control. He may have pushed the snowball down the hill, but at that point, it was an avalanche, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Unless, of course, he had deployed the National Guard, which he didn't. Mike Pence did. By about 4 o'clock, the D.C. National Guard was deployed, and between them and the Capitol Police and the D.C. Police, the building started to be cleared. Some of the rioters were delicately escorted out and helped down the stairs. Essentially, the only people that were arrested that day were people who broke the 6 p.m. curfew that the D.C. mayor had put into place. The building was deemed secure by 6 o'clock, and by 8 o'clock, Congress was back in session, determined to certify the votes. Most of the politicians were significantly chastised and removed their objections, although some politically starved politicians did manage to get their objections heard for about 30 seconds or so. At 3:24 a.m. on January 7th, the votes were certified and Trump lost the election. Everybody went home, and cleanup began the next day. The rioters caused extensive property damage. This included portraits of John Quincy Adams and James Madison, and a statue of Thomas Jefferson, all of which were covered in a corrosive gas agent residue. They were sent to the Smithsonian for restoration. A 19th century marble bust of President Zachary Taylor was smeared with what appeared to be blood, and outside, 2 19th century bronze light fixtures designed by Frank Olmsted were also damaged. This is in addition to the secured laptops that were stolen, as well as damage to walls, floors, doors, windows, etc. Because the Capitol is not insured against loss, the cost of this will go to the taxpayers. On February 19, 2021, U.S. Capitol Police suspended 6 officers, with pay, of course, for their role in the riots on January 6th. These are probably those ones that were seen opening the barriers to let some of the rioters in or taking selfies with the rioters. In addition, 29 officers remain employed but under investigation. At least 140 DC and Metropolitan Police sustained injuries during the riots. These injuries included cracked ribs, spinal injuries, traumatic brain injuries, and more. One officer lost fingers and another lost an eye. Additionally, rioters injured at least 58 DC Metro Police, including one officer that was hospitalized for 5 days after the attacks. Capitol Police Chief Stephen A. Sund said, quote, "The violent attack on the U.S. Capitol was unlike any I have ever experienced in my 30 years in law enforcement here in Washington, D.C." He has since resigned from the force. 7 people died as a result of the siege on the Capitol. A rioter who breached the Capitol was shot with what is being deemed as a clear, appropriate use of force, as she attempted to climb through a broken window into the Capitol, but the investigation is ongoing. One rioter was trampled to death, one died of a heart attack, and another of a stroke. A family member of one of the killed rioters said, quote, "The president's words incited a riot that killed 4 of his biggest fans last night." End quote. Brian Sicknick, a 42-year-old military veteran who had served on the Capitol Police for 12 years, died from his injuries sustained during the riots. Brian was described as charming, gracious, and pleasant. Brian was in the National Guard and had served in both the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. He was honorably discharged in 2003. Brian was actually an outspoken supporter of Donald Trump in the 2016 election. He was remembered for comforting a friend, Caroline Behringer, who was a staffer for Nancy Pelosi on the day after the 2016 election. Caroline said, quote, "I collapsed into him in tears, and I knew he was a Trump supporter. He was an outspoken Trump supporter, and he put that aside in that moment to comfort a friend, and it was a small gesture of kindness, but one that has always stuck with me." End quote. He's remembered as someone that loved his rescue dachshund, prized spending time at home, watching movies, and was always one to support the ice hockey team from his home state, the New Jersey Devils. Brian laid in honor in the Capitol Rotunda on February 2nd and February 3rd, 2021, and his cremated remains were buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He leaves behind his parents, brothers, and his partner of 11 years. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington has opened a federal investigation into his death. In addition to Brian's tragic death, 2 officers have died by suicide in the days following the attacks, and their deaths have also been attributed to the events of January 6th. On January 27, 2021, the Klein Center for Advanced Social Research's Coup d'etat project, a nonpartisan research center, released their findings that what happened on January 6th was an attempted dissident coup. According to them, a coup needs 5 elements. 1. There must be a person or persons who initiated the coup. 2. The target of the coup must have meaningful control over national policy. 3. There must be a credible threat to the leader's hold on power. These 3 criteria were met immediately, as there was very obviously a threat on the legislative branch of our government. Over the course of weeks, Klein Center researchers reviewed documents, got quotes from people who were at the event, and reviewed footage and photographs. According to them, the additional evidence clearly shows that the other 2 criteria were also met. 3. Illegal or irregular means must be used to try to overthrow power. They determined that 1 or more groups attempted to use their power to usurp Congress's power to certify the election results. And 5, it must be an organized effort. According to their findings, 1 or more groups planned to storm the Capitol. This video is getting pretty long, but I do recommend you check out the Klein Center. They go into depth. They talk about their methodology and their findings. Trump was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives for a 2nd time. He does carry the unfortunate torch of being the only U.S. president to be impeached twice. Additionally, It was not a totally partisan impeachment. And that's the only time that's ever happened in U.S. history. They cited his actions in inciting the violent mob that breached the Capitol as an impeachable offense. In what can only be seen as a purely political move, Senate Republicans first delayed their impeachment hearings until President Trump was no longer president, and then they claimed they didn't have the authority to impeach him because he wasn't president. I wish I could say that it was so obscenely obvious that their constituents will surely object, but somehow I highly doubt it. 400 rioters are being investigated for their role in what happened on January 6th, and over 100 of them have been arrested, including that QAnon shaman, the one with the horns. We're not even gonna go into his organic food fiasco. So what do you think? How much responsibility does Trump bear in this incident? There was pre-planning by a lot of groups, but those groups were pro-Trump supporting groups. Should Trump have been impeached by the House of Representatives? Should he have been convicted by the Senate? Does Congress have the ability to discount votes from American citizens? Does Congress have the ability to impeach a former president? How does something like this happen, and how does this make us look to the rest of the world? Oh, and how might this have been different if those protesters had been black? Trust me, the white privilege isn't lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on you either. Thanks for hanging out with me. If you have a suggestion for a case, or more importantly, a margarita, oh my gosh, this one is so good, then feel free to drop it in the comment section. Or even better, come join us on Instagram. The link is in the description box. Next week, we're covering a murder by an alum of my alma mater. Start thinking about your most infamous life connections, huh? If you're watching on YouTube and haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that, would ya? It helps. And while you're there, click the like button too. If you're listening on your favorite podcast app, please leave a review. That helps spread the word about Margs and Mayhem. See you next week, and remember, there's always alternatives to murder and stealing Nancy Pelosi's mail. That's a federal crime.